Okay, we've started the recording. So we're going to be talking today about evidence-based inclusive online teaching practices. And we will, we're going to start by talking about two hypothetical students, Sarah, who has low grades and missing assignments, and
Sam, who often submits work late and the quality of his work varies. And these are obviously generic students, as John said. So you can think about other students that you may have had in past courses that these people may remind you of.
And we've all had Sarah's and Sam's in our classes. So we've opened up a Jamboard, and Judy, if you could, it looks like you may already have put the link in the chat.
All set.
Okay, and we'd like you to think about as we go through and put in some ways of perhaps addressing it. How could you find out what the problems these students are experiencing? We have 7 slides on the Jamboard, and we're going to ask different questions as we move through, and then we'll look at them, your responses at the end. And so this is the session. And Judy, if you'd like to introduce yourself.
Yep. Hi, so my name is Judith Littlejohn. I'm the Director of Online Learning at Genesee Community College in Batavia. I also teach online. I teach history, gen ed courses, so survey courses. So that's kind of the lens that I use when I'm looking at how to add inclusion to these courses that students may not have wanted to take, but have to take.
And I'm John Kane, the director of the SELT Center here at SUNY Oswego, and I will be using examples from economics because that's what I teach, but also it's another course, or at least the intro class, that many students take because they're required to. So I think we have some similar experiences in our courses along those lines.
And I see that we have some new people who joined us, so I'm going to put the Jamboard link in the chat again. And there we go. All right. And so we've got this broken out into 4 main themes that you can see posted here. The how to structure the online course, which would be, what the things that we do before our students come into our course, presenting the content, engaging your students throughout the term, and assessing your learning outcomes, throughout or at the end of your semester.
And basically, this is the order in which you do it. The first is the basic structure, the outline, or how it's all put together. And then the next thing is, what types of materials are you going to use and how are you going to share it with students? And then the last 2 are basically the actual process of working through the course. So we're structuring this kind of in the order in which you'd be working through these things. And we're going to start with structuring the online class. And I should have gotten my remote working. Okay. And we're going to jump over to a website we put together that will contain some examples that will describe some basic principles for inclusive online instruction. And also that will have some research support for this. Let me make that full screen. Okay, so I think Judy has put the link to the website in there, and if you'd like, you can follow along, or you'll be seeing it here. But you may want to bookmark this because we do have a lot of resources in here that may be worth looking at in the future.
Yeah, and this is what we've already mentioned to you, and you can see at the top of the site, there's the Jamboard link. We will keep the Jamboard open. So if it's something you want to look at later on to see what ideas people came up with, or if you have something else, that pops into your mind that you might want to share, you'll be able to go back there and do that.
And we've got a lot of good responses already in there, so we will come back to that.
Good. All right, so the first thing was structuring the online course. We want to ensure inclusion. And so I'm thinking the lens I'm using again is for survey courses, gen ed, general education history courses. And these are asynchronous, 100% online courses. So the students are not in a classroom, they're not in Zoom. They are independent on their own, trying to successfully navigate an online course. And for inclusion, not knowing anything, you know, I see the list of names on the roster. I may recognize a couple from past courses, or they may all be new to me. So I need to ensure that every student knows exactly what to do right out of the gate by creating this clearly designated course starting point. I just blatantly use start here. I think it's the most obvious, and it gives them like an overview, which contains the learning outcomes and things like that, how to get a hold of me, how to navigate the course itself, and kind of gets them excited about history with a little video at that bottom, and then sends them right into the next bit of information I want them to read, which is my syllabus and schedule, which I put in a separate module. But this is just super important for all students, just to know what to do right away, whether you're giving them a preview period for the course or it is the first day of the class, so they know what how to get started successfully.
And we do have, for each of the points we raised, some resources that talks about why these things are important, basically providing a little bit, they're up here, a little bit of evidence of why it's important to do that. And one of the main concerns that lots of students have when working with any course management system is sometimes it's difficult to navigate, and we don't want students to spend a lot of time struggling to figure out what they need to do and where they need to go. So we want students to focus their cognitive efforts not on trying to know what to do next, and focus on actually learning the content. So the more structure we can provide and the easier it is for students to navigate, the more they can focus their efforts on the things we'd like them to learn, rather than on trying to figure out which folder you stuck some things in at some point when it made sense to you, but it may not always make sense for students.
Yeah, I think if you go down to the next examples, that's really what we were talking about now, is the intuitive and accessible layout. If you click on examples. So yeah, the course should never be a scavenger hunt. Like, you know, I hear people say, oh, I start my course off with a scavenger hunt so they can find everything. And it just makes me cringe, because that's not our goal. It should be very obvious where everything is. It should be laid out for the students. And this is just an example of how I structure things in Brightspace now. So that you can see the start here goes right to the syllabus, and then module A is first steps. And that's what I do in the first week to help them learn, you know, how Brightspace works. And then I use some third-party tools. I want them to know how those work and things like that, just in a low stakes, comfortable environment, just to kind of test the waters before we actually dive into the content, which is the module 1, chapter 1. But I like this because you know, they can move, and Brightspace is just great for this. They can just intuitively move from one module down to the next. And I do clarify on a navigation page, you know, that my expectation for the students is that they start at the top of the module and proceed through it, because I know that students can click all over. If there's another way to get to discussions or assignments, they might jump right to something without having engaged with the content first. So I try to keep them right on track.
And many people in Blackboard used to use folders as a way of organization. That's really discouraged in Brightspace. That linear fashion, that linear progress that Judy was just talking about, is the recommended way of designing a course and building it in Brightspace, so that students just finish something, they go on to the next component, the next activity right away.
The next one, the consistent imagery and themes. This is part that I love. Like, I love the graphic design side of it, but I love to make these little banners that so kind of set a theme for a whole course. And I like that the students know where they are, because I reuse those banners throughout all the content in a module. So for example, if you could scroll down a little bit more, you can see, so module 2 starts with this about module 2, and they recognize the banner from the image that they clicked on to get here. And then they'll work through all the materials, and at the end, there we are at the end of module 2. And I like to really clearly designate, if you did A, B, C, and D, you have completed your work for this week. And, you know, we'll see you on Saturday when the next week opens. And I like there's a lot right there and all that. So it's intuitive how they would work through it. They know what they have to do at the start, They would work through all the materials that are presented right there, and then it's very clear to them when they're finished. Because I know sometimes if they're hopping around, skipping through different activities in parts of the course, they might not know if they're done yet. So.
And you will notice as we go through that all the visual examples are from Judy's course because they look nicer than those in mine, but I use a very similar structure in my course. And, one of the things that's noted there is that in the activities, there's a pretty consistent pattern from module to module, again, to give students that sense of familiarity, that they may struggle a little bit trying to figure out what to do and when to do it the first week or so, but you don't want that to be a scavenger hunt, as Judy said, every week. Using a consistent set of activities and deadlines and requirements can make things a lot easier for students because they get used to the routine, and that routine can reduce their cognitive effort.
Yeah, I would actually note, John and I use the same. We both use the Waymakers through Lumen Learning for our principal's courses. So in the fall, he has a big lecture and an online, asynchronous online. And then in the spring, I have the macro big lecture. And then one of the benefits that came out of it that I hadn't really expected when I adopted it was it's really set up that I not only have modules, but a module's a week. So it's like week 1, here's the dates, and you open it and here's everything you have to do this week. Yeah. Things you need to read, videos, that might be useful, the quiz, the homework, the discussion, it's all in there. And like you said, you don't have to hunt for it. So I actually think it's really important too now to reorganize. My modules are chronological, right? They're not by type. So I don't have a folder of quizzes or a folder of homeworks, right? You have a folder that's a week, and here's everything you have to do this week.
Yeah,
I've always used modules in that way as organizers of content that were sequential for that very reason. But I know a lot of people had different folders, as Liz mentioned, for different activities. That in general was never, I think, ideal, but it's less ideal even in Brightspace when students get used to this linear progress pattern that they're going to see in at least most of their courses, or at least in all of the courses where people who had gone through the Brightspace training early on.
Can I just follow up? I guess I have a question about that, because you have the linear progress. So you're in a folder, and yeah, I want them to read the study plan first, because that's like the reading of the ebook. But then after that, it's not necessarily, do they do the quiz first? Do they do a problem set first? Do they do a discussion post first? So I wonder how you might decide that when you're in a module and here's everything you need to do this week. I don't know that, beyond maybe the first couple things, there's not really an order to it. So
yeah,
I do have
that line up so that the students are engaging with the learning materials first.
Right.
But I know Waymaker often has that like quiz first, so you can kind of identify where your learning gaps are. So I usually have them read the chapter, look at a PowerPoint, do the videos that are related, and then go on to their mastery quiz, because I use Inquisitive and Norton, and then do their course learning outcome assignment that goes along with that chapter. But I think though that the students might do that with week 1, chapter 1, or module 1, chapter 1. But I think afterward, once they get the hang out of what's going on, what all's in their folder, or what the expectation is each week, I think they figure out what order works best for them. Because some of them do like to do that quiz first. If it's a mastery setup where they can keep doing it again and again without penalty, then it helps them hone in on what it is they need to focus on the most in their reading. Whereas other students like to read the whole thing from page 1 to the last page and get into everything. So yeah, I kind of feel like they'll figure it out. And then I also have the students throughout the course kind of talking to each other a little bit about what's working for them and and we'll get to that a little bit later on here. But then they'll share ideas and tips to help each other out.
And another really useful tool is to use a checklist tool, because students really appreciate it, and then they can check off things as they do them, so that if they do choose a different sequence, they can keep track of what they've completed and what they haven't. But even if students may do it in different,
as well in the chat, and I use those too. That I really like those. And you can take those, you can export those out of one course and put them into another, and then just edit them. I find that a lot easier than going from course to course and starting all new checklists up.
And then once you create the first one, you can copy it for the next module and so forth. And it's really easy to do, and students really appreciate it. I've got more comments about that than pretty much anything. And the most common comment was, I wish all faculty would do this.
So does the checklist double up? Like if you have a checklist, you know, it has quiz, problem set, study plan, whatever, but then the actual quiz, probably study plans also show up in the calendar. So do you get this? There's like this double counting in the calendar that has the checklist entry and then the actual quiz.
Yeah,
You-
so for that, I took all the dates off of the checklists. So they're
Okay.
just generic, and then I
Okay.
put them in the module, you know, that edit properties in place where you can put the due dates right on your discussions and quizzes within the module. I think that's easier. It's so cleaner in the calendar.
Okay.
But they should be in one place. So either do it within the activity or in the checklist, but you probably don't want to duplicate it.
Mhm. The next one, though, we're talking about using integrated elements to create the clear learning path. And that one is, if John would click on the examples. So this is an example. I mentioned that we do, you know, I have students watch different videos, and sometimes those are part of the Norton materials, but sometimes they're out on YouTube. And so when we're talking about integrated materials, we're talking about pulling the content in. So the students are engaging with it right here. They can click on that video, they can full screen it, but they're not going out to YouTube. They're not getting the ads on the side. They're not getting suggested videos to go to and things that they watched before and so on and so forth. So I'm not losing them to that black hole, you know, where something looks appealing, so they click on it and then now they're gone. So that's anything that you can pull in to reduce the temptation to wander out into no man's land, I think is good to help keep the students on track.
Because YouTube is set up for students' own accounts to put other videos that they might be interested in based on their past viewing history. And it's very good at catching your attention and keeping it there. And you don't want that attention to wander away from the course. So embedding the videos is really good. And one other thing I'd like to point out is that Judy does this, and I do the same thing in accordion folders, because if you put a lot of embed codes in, it makes a page really long. But if you have multiple videos, you can either have them on separate accordion items, or you could even group them. In my course, I have 3 or 4 subtopics in each course module, and I just group them. So I may have 3 or 4 supplemental videos on each of the topics, and they just click on it, it opens up, and they can see all the videos that they could use to review if they need that additional support without cluttering up the screen and making something seem like a lot more work.
Yeah, and they look really nice. And you can see on mine, like I always put how long each video is, kind of to help them gauge what they can, you know, depending on how long they have right now while they're sitting down to work on their course materials, you know, they can plan what video to start up and so forth. So I like that. They just look so nice. I love accordions. And then the next thing we want to plan in our course is like consistent structures. So like things like assignments and rubrics, so that once students go through one assignment and figure out what they need to know from it and what the expectation is, then the following similar types of assignments are going to have the same structure. And this is just an example I use in American history, where they're engaging with the primary sources. So you can see like there are clear directions at the top. I explain what the documents are, what the instructions are, and then at the bottom, the actual primary documents I put in the tabs so they can click from one to the other right there. And then from that, they move on to their activity. So once they do the first one, they know what the expectation is, they know how it flows, they get to the next one, they're ready to go. They don't have to try to figure out how it works again, you know. And the same with the rubrics, if which I don't have an example of from Brightspace in here, but rubrics we were talking about yesterday, and I'm a big fan of putting the best requirement, the highest grade level right in that first column, because I don't think students read the whole rubric. And if they're only going to read, you know, if you figure if they're reading from left to right, I want that best criteria right there. if that's all they see, that's a beautiful thing and I'm fine with it. But other than that, John, what else did you want to add about rubrics?
Well, it also makes your expectations transparent, because what students will often do when they take a new course with a new instructor is they'll wait for the first graded activity to try to figure out what the instructor wants. And if you only have 3 or 4 exams or 3 or 4 assignments in your class, they could essentially bury themselves really early. So if you do have some assignments that are higher stakes in papers or other things, or even for the weekly discussions, having a rubric makes it clear to students exactly what they're going to be graded on and makes that whole process transparent, so that students don't have to guess what you think is important. They get to see what you think is important right there before they start the activity. And it makes it so much simpler for students, because sometimes students, especially first-gen students who haven't worked with, let's say, a formal academic paper, may not know what's expected of them. So the students who come from college, from high schools where lots of students go on to college, have generally had some experience writing formal papers. Students from low-income school districts tend not to have had that same type of experience. And by making your expectations clear, it makes things so much easier for students, so they don't have to guess what you want.
All right, and if we just scroll down a little bit, we're gonna go circle back to Sam for a minute. And remember, we've got Sam and Sarah that we're trying to help out here. And so this is, we kind of want to get people's input on this. So Sam's teacher added some extra credit assignments to the course in the final week of class. Is this inclusive? Is this inclusive? Extra credit assignments thrown into the final weeks. And we can talk about it or not. There are, we brainstorm some options there. And we can take a look at those, or if people want to. So Liz said loud and clear, no. And I'm in Liz's camp. Donna agrees. Yeah, so why don't you click on the options there, John, so they can see.
So yeah, yeah, I was just glancing at the chat. There is a lot of chat that's been going on, but okay.
So here's some arguments, right? Oh, and Michelle, welcome. And I'll give you the URL to where we are. So you can argue, yes, it's inclusive because everybody gets the chance to raise their grade. But then we can say no, because it's adding an additional burden to students who are already struggling. And that's kind of where I see it. I kind of feel that extra credit is elitist by nature, because it's the students who have the time to take on that extra work who are the ones that benefit from it, not the students who really need the extra boost. So, and then we've got some bullets under there, like an inclusive course does not need extra credit. And of course, I always hear things like, if you go to this lecture, show us your ticket and you get 5 points. If you go here and do this, go here and do that. And so that's why that bullet there that says an asynchronous course should not have location-based requirements. But yeah, so if you can think of other options within the course itself to help the students out instead of piling something, especially throwing it on right at the end, if they have 5 or 6 classes, it's just going to bury them.
And if students are struggling to learn the basic material in the class, having them do something different from the course is not really going to help them. That we do want to make sure that they master the basics before we ask them to do anything extra. What I've often told students, and this probably is not the best way of phrasing it, that if they were able to quickly master all the material and they weren't being challenged by the class, I'd be happy to give them some extra work. But what I encourage them to do is go back and use the opportunities that they have to improve their learning, and to go through and retake some of the quizzes that they can retake and so forth, so that they're actually learning the things we expect of them from the course. And attending a lecture may be in some cases useful, but for many of our courses, it doesn't really tie to the learning objectives. And again, with students who are working at different hours or working remotely and struggle to commute or find rides, it's not a very fair option, as Judy has mentioned.
All right, so we need to get moving a little bit because we do have 3 more sections to go through. But the next part, so that was kind of like setting up the course at the beginning. And now And some of this presenting the learning materials also, you hopefully people are able to get those all done before the class starts. I mean, ideally, right? But so presenting the learning materials, if we look at providing multiple means of representation of course content, that can be different types of media, different types of content, but also I think it's really important within your multiple means of representation to include some content that's relevant to the students and their current and expected future lives. So if I have students from all over in my, like US history course, if I can include the history of other groups in the US, that's going to help the students relate to the content better and connect with the course better.
Yeah, so basically, we just want to find more ways to help students make connections with their learning materials, because the same content won't work as well with every student. I remember taking it in grad school, taking a linear algebra course that was just proof after proof. It was only when I got to apply those concepts in a different framework that all that made a lot of sense, when it didn't when I initially took the course. We want to find ways of helping students connect to the material, and we can sometimes do that by asking them to make the connections. If the materials you have don't necessarily provide many options for connecting, ask students directly to try to connect the material to things in their own life or their expected careers. And that will often help them make connections that may not be made necessarily by reading the textbook or by reading some other formal documents.
And this ties really closely with the next one, where we're looking for diverse authors to hear the voice of the marginalized populations or the underrepresented populations, especially in a course like history, and it can be really difficult to find this. And John and I were talking about this yesterday too, where and again, we thought asking the students to share what they have, and always having a place available within your course where when something comes out in the news or like in a blog or a podcast or what have you, that's relevant to your content, especially if it's one of those underrepresented voices, you can add that right into your course and make it available to the students to look at when they have time. But I think that it's just so important that the students see themselves represented in the course.
And if they are from groups that are underrepresented, mentioning that explicitly, that there is a lack of representation in these groups, and that's an area that needs to be addressed and worked on. I know in the Cornell Inclusive Teaching MOOC, that was one of the things they talked about. In some classes, they just could not find literature that appealed or that involved certain groups because there were topics that just weren't discussed at various time periods. And mentioning that explicitly as a challenge is not a bad idea necessarily. And for this next topic, one of the things that happens is we've always had students come in with very diverse backgrounds, but that's increased dramatically since the pandemic. That there have been some really large learning losses in across all institutions, but it's larger in some institutions that are less well funded. For example, in Brazil, they found that the dropout risk increased by 365%. Test scores fell so that students were only learning 27.5% as much with remote instruction as with in-person instruction. There's a typo there. And certainly, the US scorecard results in some fairly dramatic differences where the poorest students, or the poorest 25% of school districts, lost about 2/3 of a year in math learning during the pandemic with remote instruction, and wealthier school districts didn't lose as much. So we have to provide support for students who come in with very different backgrounds. And one way of doing that is using adaptive learning platforms like the Waymaker package that Liz used, or a package that Judy uses with her history class, but you can also put in YouTube videos and other things that students could be referred to if they do have a weaker background in that. There's really good YouTube videos created by tens of thousands of people out there on pretty much any topic you could imagine. And just providing students with that additional support can be really helpful.
This is an example of what Norton Inquisitive looks like. So and it's bundled with the one textbook, and these cost under $40 for the students. But this gives them, it's mastery quizzing. So it's going to ask the question and then send them right back to where they can find out more information about the topic if they get a question wrong. And that's why I like this so much, because they can circle back, they'll read about it. And once they try to investigate why they're wrong, they're going to understand that content that much more and remember it better going forward. So this is just a quick example of this question was wrong. If you go to this page 358 and scroll down some more, you can find what's relevant to that and why the answer was wrong. And it's these take about 2 hours per chapter for the students to do. But it's such a valuable use of their time. And they start out every semester grumbling about how long it takes. And then at the end of the semester, they say, oh, my favorite thing was Inquisitive, because I knew, they're also gaming it, right? So they're betting how well they think they know the content. So they're going to lose points if they're wrong. And then they have to earn those points back by being correct going forward. And they enjoy that process too. And they really get comfortable with these quizzes as they go on. And that's kind of all we have in there so far about content. And there you'll see that at the end of this website, there's a place for you to add and suggest things to put on here, which we'll show you that when we get down there. But so it's just something to keep in mind. If you have things you want to add and points you want to make, there is room for that. And you are welcome to do so. And so the next big chunk of topics is engaging with the students. And the first one right out of the gate is provide ways for the students to get to know you, like you as a human being teaching the course, know you as a person. And the course welcome video is a great way to do that. Anything that you can share with the students, the tone of your syllabus, the welcoming syllabus is always a good approach. You can share with students what your learning journey was, and let them know like what interested you in your subject area, and what your learning process was, and anything that helps them relate to you on that one-to-one level, like you share in the classroom or after or before class or in the hall, is really helpful to the students. And yeah, John put the motivation and emotion video for us to look at, and that's just a quick I think that's a picture of the video that I use just to go over my syllabus and so forth.
Yeah, so there's 2 sample videos. One is Judy's and one is from Sarah Rose Kavanaugh for her class. Just as examples, you can find lots of intro videos out there online too. But it's a really good way of making connection with remote students. It doesn't have to be long. It doesn't have to be professionally done. I'm not sure if this is the one in which a cat walks across Judy's screen or not, but that was something that provided a little bit more of a connection with students.
And the next one, of course, we want the students to get to know each other, helping students connect, either, help them identify common interests. Obviously, if they have the same major, if you're doing a discipline-specific course for majors or general education courses like I am, I always have them say what their major is and then find other topics to share ideas about. And we talked about this a little bit a few minutes ago, where one thing John and I have both tried extensively is some type of discussion where they're talking about how they're learning and sharing ideas with each other. And these are awesome ways to build community in the classroom. It also alleviates the sense of isolation that the truly remote learner can feel, just by saying, they can say, I can ask a question like, hey, how long did it take you to read this week's chapter, and was there anything that you had trouble with? And a student might post, well, this chapter took me 3 hours and I had to read this section 4 times before I finally got it, and I just feel like an idiot. And then another student might reply and say, oh my gosh, that's how I felt, and I'm glad that I'm not alone. And then another student variable will say, well, it took me 45 minutes because I already knew A, B, C, and D. And then they just start having these conversations. And I think anyone who's taught online for a while knows that students would kind of migrate towards specific students who they reply to, whether it be because of the timing of the post or because they just get used to somebody's writing style and they like to reply to it. But I think that the more we can encourage that kind of back and forth and that community building, I think the better the chances are that we will get our students to stay with us through the duration of the semester.
And students really appreciate that. Again, this is something at the end of the term, students will say, even though it was a very low stakes activity, it's like 5% of their grade in my course, my online courses, they said it was one of the most useful tools. And as Judy said, when they hear other students say that this was one of the most difficult chapters and they felt really lost, hearing from every other student that they felt the same way and having them share strategies is a really good way of getting them past that type of thing. They're no longer as isolated. They don't feel alone in finding something more challenging. But if they're sitting there alone late at night trying to work through this material by themselves, it's really easy for students to give up. But when other students said, well, I had trouble with this too, but I looked at these review videos and that helped me work through it. Or I tried some of these practice problems, or I watched these other videos, and or I use this other tool. And they share resources that way. And it really does build a sense of community, which often shows up in other aspects of the course. I think we both have some content discussion forums. And one of the things that I found is that what they learn about each other in these informal discussions often makes the other connections in the content discussions much stronger, because they'll learn about what they're doing, what their career goals are, what their life experiences are, whether they're in the military or whether they're working full time, whether they're trying to raise children and so forth, and some of the challenges they have meeting all their obligations. And that just creates a much better sense of knowing each other than normally happens in many online classes.
And so here's Sam again. He's just popping in to remind everybody about the Jamboard. And I put a link in there as well. So we won't stay on that right now, just a reminder. And then, yeah, so metacognition, thinking about learning, just goes hand in hand with reflection and trying to help the students think back, especially, once you get a few weeks into the semester, think back to what they started with. How does the material all tie together? What progress have they made, and how can they use this in the future? How can they transfer this new knowledge to their other courses? It's just so important. And, having them go back and think about it and think about common themes and cause and effect and things like that throughout the learning journey we all know is so important for the students. And if they can do this publicly a little bit and comment on each other's, they'll benefit from each other's reflection process as well. Another great thing for inclusion in a course is to provide a diversity statement and be overt in your intention to make sure that all students feel welcome. And we've got some examples and resources. There's some really great helpful sites. I put this inclusive excellence statement in my courses, and I was thinking about this myself, and where I think I fall down is I put it out there, I mention it at the beginning, but I need to circle back a little bit more and remind students that this is being accepting of each other and making everybody feel welcome is one of the core values that I have in my course. I want to make sure that it's overtly demonstrated. And one of the sites John's got in the resources there
Well, actually, even at the bottom of this in the examples are links to pages that have collections of diversity and inclusion syllabus statements. So if you're not sure how to phrase them, take a look at these two sites and they provide a lot more. The resources mostly provide the evidence behind this in terms of what studies have found about the effectiveness of this. But just to come up with some examples, take a look at those sites.
Yeah, and sometimes I think about land acknowledgements as well, but I think it's a little bit trickier in the online course. And I have, I'm still sorting that out in my head because I feel like it's important to, if you acknowledge whose land we're on, that's a start, but to just acknowledge it and then let that lie there flat, I don't think is helpful. I think we're supposed to then think about what, and then what, what do we do with that information? How, what can we do that's good from that? And that's kind of where I'm hung up. So if anybody has ideas about that, please share those as well. And the next one is coming up with the small group and paired activities. Or did we miss? Oh, I skipped over Sarah. Sorry, John. I skipped right over her. You want to go ahead with that?
Oh, go ahead. This was yours.
Oh, okay. So the next one is, okay, so Sarah's instructor, as you can see, she's asking the students, which is an example of a typical Sunday dinner: roast beef and potatoes, enchiladas and rice, or dinner in a restaurant. So is this kind of question inclusive? What do you think? What are your, like, just off the top of your head, thoughts on that? Michelle said no. Gary, you can go ahead and talk if you want.
Oh, sorry, I didn't realize I wasn't muted. I apologize.
Oh, that's okay. Well, you're welcome to talk.
Just catching up to what's going on.
Yeah, and Kristen pointed out typical. Yeah, so I think there's some things to unpack in there. And Linda's offended. And yeah, so we I agree, Linda. I can see where this is offensive, but I try to phrase it like a little softer and said they could be right or wrong depending on several variables, right? But I like this other example question where we say, describe a special dinner you may have seen or attended, and then talk about that. I think that would be, as Donna said, it could be more inclusive if they could write their own response. And I think to this second type of question, they really could.
If
So
you really want to treat diversity as an asset, hear diverse voices. Don't impose your preconceptions on the students in general. That may not be the type of question you'd ask, but there are many other ways in which that could show up in a course.
yeah, I think that was well phrased, John. All right. And then we go to the small group and paired activities. And this is one of the things that, I go around and around with. I've tried different projects over the years, and I want to try to help students find ways to work together. They don't always want to, but we've got two key examples here. John, why don't you go down to the examples, because I think that this is one that you'd like to talk about.
So one example is the podcast project that I use in my classes. And I actually have students work synchronously, but what I do is I set up a discussion forum where they can suggest topics that they might be interested in working on. And I ask them to try to find one or two other people to work on it. And I ask them to post times when they'd be available to work. So even though it's an asynchronous course and we don't want to require students to work synchronously, if it's just 2 people or 3 people, they generally can find some time during the week when they can get together for an hour or so. But they always have the option, if they can't come up with partners because of their schedules, they can do it individually. But it's just I'd like them to make connections with each other whenever they can. And it's certainly much more interesting hearing a discussion between 2 or 3 people on a podcast than just a monologue. But usually there's 1 or 2 students who either prefer to do it themselves or can't find times or a topic to work with other students. But it's worked really well in general, and they've enjoyed it. They were generally scared about it. And when it was first introduced, saying, I've never recorded anything. I don't like the sound of my voice. The same things many faculty would say when they talk about recording their classes, but or watching videos or listening to them on a podcast, for example. But once they do it, they end up finding it really useful. And quite a few students have created their own podcasts afterwards. Judy?
So that's, and mine is the one below there, the potential timeline topics. I try to have students do some timelines where they can chart, how something has changed over time throughout history. And in this way, they kind of self-sort into these little groups of 3 by the topic that they're interested in. Because as I've said a couple of times, like, they don't all want to take this course, but they have to meet these general education requirements. But by finding opportunities for them to choose based on the topic they're interested in, that can help increase their engagement with the course. So in this instance, there's a whole long list of topics that they can sign up for, and then they would share information with each other as they discover it throughout the course. And then they would put together a timeline at the end for their final project. And this is all asynchronous. They are encouraged to discuss, and I do set up discussion boards for each topic so they can post and share things. They could work together synchronously if they chose to, but typically they stay asynchronous. And that, and that's the blog. That was the old Blackboard blog tool. And I've got to figure that out for Brightspace, because I have that class this semester. But anyway, I'll cross that bridge really soon.
Could be done in Google Docs or something similar, though, with a link to it. So there's lots of ways in which you can still do that type of thing, I think.
I'll have to make a decision.
Another thing you can do is include active learning, because one of the most inclusive practices that you can do is use active learning activities where students are just not passively reading something, but they're actively engaged in creating something or actively engaged in using the materials. And there's lots of ways they could do that. You could, for example, and I just mentioned some of the research there that the meta-analysis found that active learning significantly reduces the equity gap for underrepresented students on test scores by 1/3, and the gap in passing rates by 45%. And that's a pretty dramatic difference. Students prefer passive reading. They'd much prefer either listening to video recordings of lectures or reading a book or something and then taking test questions. But one of the problems is they don't learn as much with that. And to the extent to which we can build in active learning activities into our online classes, the more the students will learn. And the projects that we mentioned were just a couple of examples of that, the podcast project or the timeline type project, but there's lots of ways of doing it. And having students create materials, maybe some open pedagogy projects where they might create a video or they might do some type of documentary or something similar, or perhaps use a blog. And we do have the SUNY Create option at all SUNY institutions now, where where you can set up a WordPress blog for your classes, for example. There's lots of things that you can do. And also one other thing I'd like to mention is that there are a number of tools out there that will let you create videos and embed questions in them. So if students are going to listen to a lecture, don't just let them sit there passively listening to it while they're doing something else, because students may tend to do that, as many of us would as well. Embed questions in it. And if there's questions embedded in it, it forces them to engage with the material quite a bit more than if there's not. And there's some really good tools for that. Infographics are another thing you could use. And you could also do some peer review, and there's some really good tools for that available as well.
Yeah, and our example here is more of like a multiple means of expression, or different ways, providing different ways for your students to demonstrate their learning. So I have like a typical writing assignment, but then the students can create the graphic representation. They can do a narrated PowerPoint, they can write a comic strip. And what they do with this is they're meeting the specific learning outcome there, explain the significance of distinctive terms. You can see it up at the top. But they can meet that same learning outcome in all these other ways. And they still have to cite their sources, provide a bibliography, which, previously they would also annotate this bibliography so we can see how they're fitting each source into their little presentation. And I love it. I love when the students make a video or do something different than a paper. I just think it's outstanding. So yeah, that's just that type of an example.
And that type of activity is sometimes referred to as an essay project. And Maggie's going to be doing a workshop on her experimentation with that later this week or next week. Tomorrow. Okay. So it's coming up soon.
Another thing that's really helpful to the students is acting on their feedback. So we always ask for feedback, or hopefully we ask for feedback, but if you can then take that and do something with it so that they know, the students can see that their voice mattered, that their suggestion is taken seriously, and it really helps the students feel some kind of ownership over their own course and their own learning. And I just love that kind of situation, and I try to incorporate that where I can. So one example I have is, one of these timeline projects. So in some courses, they kind of do them throughout the course, but in others, they are accumulating knowledge and information as the course progresses, and then they make their timeline at the end. And I always do like a halftime survey. I call it halftime survey with the students, and try to get suggestions or kind of check how they're doing. And I had one student say she was waiting to see the rubric for that final timeline and didn't understand why I didn't post it earlier in the class. And in my mind, I was thinking, well, I don't want to stress him out with this right out of the gate. I want him to get the flow of the course under him, and then I'll introduce that later on. And then I thought, well, there's nothing wrong with giving her the rubric up front. So then I immediately took that action and posted the rubric and heard back from her, and she was, grateful. And it was a very small action. It was a great suggestion from her. It was very little effort for me to just make something available sooner, and it helped her out in the long run. So being able to act on their feedback and have them see that's visible, I think is really helpful if you're able to do that. I know it's not always something we can do, but where you can, I would strongly encourage that.
But even if they have feedback that you can act on, or you have a strong pedagogical reason for not doing what they suggest, responding to them and saying, I understand why you feel this way. However, these are the reasons why I'm still going to do it. At least lets them know that they've been heard, and you have a reason for why you're doing things the way you do. So
yeah, that's good. The next one, the maintaining consistent communications, is important in any class, but definitely it's important for inclusion. And it's also a key component of regular and substantive interaction, which I like to address, because it's a federal requirement now that we do demonstrate regular and substantive interactions in our 100% asynchronous courses, because that is what proves to the student and to our accrediting agencies that human beings are teaching the course, and they're not just correspondence courses. So I think it's important. So at the beginning, right, we introduced ourselves, we made a video or did something, we shared something about ourselves so the students can get to know us, try to participate in discussions where appropriate. We're giving individualized feedback, but there still has to be something that's demonstrating that you're connecting with all the students in ways that are related to their learning outcomes throughout the duration of the course. And so I think that, what is our example here? I'm just drawing a blank. Oh yeah, so I try to put something in all of my courses, like how to be successful and then how to communicate with me. And I just tell them, exactly when I'm sending out my announcements, so they know what they can expect. And then I tell them how frequently or the time span between when I get an email from them and when I'll be able to reply, which is typically 24 hours. Well, it's typically less, but I try to, sometimes you just can't do it right away. But setting up some type of schedule. I always think when we do regular and substantive interaction here on our campus, I always have the faculty write out their communication plan. And when I write this to my students and say, I will send you an announcement every Sunday and every Thursday. I do it because I told them I'm going to. It's in writing, it's right there, they can point to it. And I get in this pattern of sending out these announcements. And some semesters, like this semester, I have 3 courses, and I can easily get overwhelmed with where am I? Did I send this one? Did I send that one? So I'll just track them in a little journal that I have. But I always make sure that I follow through on this, even if it's just something to say, hey, I'm here, I'm checking in, let me know if you're having any trouble. But then try to tie it also into the learning outcomes or what's coming up next so they can be prepared. So just that consistent communication. They know you're still there. They know they're not alone. And plus it's just helping with their learning anytime you expand on the content that's related to their learning outcomes.
And Judy mentioned the responding within 24 hours as something she always does. But, if you're not going to respond to emails on weekends or evenings, be explicit about that. So that's because I think the default position of many students is if they send you an email, they expect a response very quickly. But if you upfront tell them you will respond, but not after 5 p.m. or not after midnight, or you'll respond Monday through Friday, but you're going to separate the time on weekends and not respond then. Being explicit about that will, again, reduce any disappointment with not hearing rapid responses, because you're setting boundaries and you're letting them know that, those types of boundaries can be useful, which may be a good lesson for them to learn as well.
Yeah, and I'll just clarify quickly that the reason I say that is my full-time job is director of online learning. And so when I teach, I'm teaching as an adjunct. And that's why, like, I grade on Saturday, I grade on Sunday, and that's why I don't take the weekends off the table, just because of my own personal situation. But yeah, it's perfectly acceptable to say, hey, if you email me Friday night, I'll get back to you Monday. And that's fine. You've got to make this fit into your life too. So where are we? Formative feedback. So now we're moving on to the 4th part, or D, the D part, where we're assessing the students' learning in our inclusive courses. And formative feedback, of course, is a huge part of this. And John wrote this little paragraph here, and it's really, I think it's helpful to point out that he wrote the statement that there's some evidence that delayed feedback results in more learning than feedback received immediately after a test. And to me, that makes sense, because they've submitted their work or done whatever, and then there's a little gap of time, and then they get the feedback, because now they're reading the feedback. It's related to what they did yesterday or several hours ago. So now they're reflecting back on that and kind of refreshing the knowledge in their minds. And I've got a little example there that I really liked, that I did not write. Another history person here at our campus wrote this, but I thought this was just great formative feedback. He said, this is a good essay. It would have been better if you included, the 13th, 14th, and 15th amendments. And then he goes back and says, your spelling is excellent, and so it's kind of like that sandwich, right? He's got a good thing, and then a way to strengthen it, and then another good thing at the end. So I like that personally.
And the research is really mixed in terms of what sort of delay is best. As little as an hour delay has been shown as being important in helping reinforce learning. Even a day or two will not generally harm it. A month or two probably would not be so useful, but the results are really mixed. But in any case, receiving feedback on work is better than not receiving feedback. So if you have some multiple choice questions or automated questions of some type, it's really helpful if students get some feedback on the responses. And it could be automated because, again, even getting immediate feedback is better than not getting feedback. And letting students know what they got right and what they got wrong, rather than just telling them that, you know, they got this many questions wrong. It's important.
And then incorporating equity-based assessments whenever you can, things like the mastery learning, giving students that chance to practice without penalty before they have to move on to the high stakes assessment, I think is so important. Getting that feedback so they know what they can strengthen before they do that next assignment is so important. And yeah, I would say providing more feedback on their initial attempts, scaffolding things, and that's what our example is down below. But I think that all of this is so helpful to the students and kind of breaks things down so that they can be successful in each component along the way, and then put it all together for that summative score, not just you know, the 30th of every month you have to submit a paper and that's that. I really like this approach where they're thoughtful in each step along the way and getting feedback on what they're doing.
Yeah, if you have a major paper assignment, for example, just grading the paper when it comes in, or even just a draft of the paper, is often too late to really redirect student effort. That if you can break up a complex higher stakes assignment into multiple low stakes components, you're able to give students feedback all through the process. And if they're going in a direction that's not very productive or doesn't align with the course objectives, you can redirect that early on and give them support and help them make mistakes when it's easy, help them correct mistakes when it's easier to do so. Waiting until the end is really not very useful, and it really tends to discourage students that they end up with a project that's not acceptable in some way. And nudging them along the way is useful, and it also makes it much less likely that they'll engage in academic dishonesty, because if you've been giving them feedback through the whole process, it's more likely that they're going to be doing something where they don't get to the end of the project and discover that they need to write a 20-page paper by tomorrow. If they've done it in small steps, as Judy has here, and I do the same thing in my classes with larger projects, propose a topic, discuss that, give them some feedback, ask them to submit a bibliography or an outline, and then a bibliography, and then an annotated bibliography, and then a rough draft, and so forth, with feedback all along. If you have larger classes, you can also supplement that with peer feedback. You can share the work and have students comment on it with each other. Everyone in SUNY has access to perusal. We here have access to hypothesis. That can be used to do it. There's other ways of doing it, but those are really simple and easy to use tools where students can provide feedback right within other students' work, which can be really useful.
And look, it's Sam. I know somehow Sarah got left out of, or Sarah got left out of out loud exercises, but this one's a little bit trickier. This is the last one. So Sam's instructor wants to provide multiple means of expression in Sam's class. So instead of a written exam, the students are going to be required to read and compare two journal articles. And how they're going to compare it is open, but they're starting with these two journal articles. Is this inclusive? We could say yes, because they can read and expand on the topic, or no, because they're locked into reading, the act of reading for high stakes. You could say, is it the act of reading or is it the act of comparing the two articles? But let's do our further options. I think we're all getting tired. But this one, I like this one because, you know, we're saying now we're getting a little bit more insight into Sam. The instructor didn't know that Sam is dyslexic because he never filed accommodation notices. And that's because most online students do not. 65% of students who are in fully online programs who are eligible for accommodations never file them. So, so we have to operate on the assumption that our students are dyslexic, they are colorblind, they are hard of hearing, and we have to design and work through our courses with this assumption in place. But how could we make this assignment inclusive? We can just point out to the students how the LMS itself, Brightspace, is excellent. It's got a lot of accessibility things built right into it, and they can click on the speaker icon to hear the article. And most students too, in their web browser, the operating system on their computer, they've got these tools in place. Sometimes they need these to be pointed out to them. So if you're aware of this and feel that it would be useful, it's just a great thing to add to your directions. And Kristen's asking, any idea what percentage in face-to-face classes don't file? And
It's pretty close to that.
I think it is pretty close. And then again, though, sometimes people will have disabilities or differences that you can see. And in the online class, you're never going to see them. So, but I do think that they're comparable numbers of students who don't file. But I think the students that are in the classroom have a little bit of an edge because you can see how they're reacting to things and how they're responding.
And I have heard it's over half. I don't remember the exact proportions, but a large number of students with learning disabilities don't file for accommodations.
And then in addition to that, many people will, throughout the course of a semester, have a temporary disability that we might never see. You know, if you have some kind of eye surgery or you break your arm or something like that, that might be just a temporary thing for, 3, 4, 5, 6 weeks of the course. And then the rest of the course, you don't have that struggle. But so things like that are really just good to keep in mind when you're designing for these students that you're not going to see. They're not in the room with you and they can't always tell you what's going on. But so just more food for thought when you're building your inclusive class. And another thing is the alternative assessments, the ungrading, labor-based grading, portfolio assessment, and peer assessment, which I think each of these is their own session, right? We can have sessions on ungrading, labor-based grading, portfolio assessment, and peer assessment. I think John probably has some of these scheduled in. But we just like to raise these again because they are excellent ways to be inclusive in the classroom where you're having the conversation with the student about what your expectation is of them and how you'll be working together to evaluate their work. And they have some input on what it is they hope to achieve as well.
And one of the common factors in all this is that with traditional grading systems, especially when there's high stakes assessments, students are focused on their grades rather than on learning. And the goal of all the alternative assessment programs or alternative assessment approaches is to shift the focus to have students focus on learning the most rather than trying to play the game of getting the highest possible grade. And there's a whole variety of ways of doing that, as Judy said, each of which could be easily a full hour or more discussion. And we do have a lot of resources there. We have some podcasts, we have a lot of blog posts and so forth that describe all these things. So if you want to experiment with those, or we do have a workshop coming up on it sometime in the next couple of weeks too. But there's a lot of discussion out there, and it's probably one of the hottest topics that's being explored in many institutions right now.
And the last thing that we have on here is to implement best practices for assessment. And in this one, we're talking about the actual settings you're using in your LMS. So wherever possible, don't impose time limits. And there's nothing more stressful to me personally than to see that timer or to hear it, tick, tick, tick. And then I just get very stressed out, and I'm trying to cover everything and make sure everything's done. And I'm just so distracted by the time that I just will start watching the time and kind of shoot myself in the foot that way. But, and then sometimes like in your LMS, you can have those forced completion settings. Don't do those if you can avoid that. That's also something that can hinder the success of some of your students. And the third bullet, I know it can be controversial for some people, but I always suggest that we don't grade based on spelling and grammar unless those are part of your course learning outcomes or objectives. I tell my students that as long as I can understand their point, as long as I can figure out what they're telling me, I'm not going to penalize them for their grammar and spelling. You know, obviously, if you don't know what they're saying, they gotta circle back and make some corrections. And I do tell them, like I'll point out these things, and I always take one or two examples and just write it out like this, you know, how they could be rewritten, how they should be spelled, what should be capitalized. But I don't take points off for it. But I do expect them going forward to use, you know, whatever that information I shared with them, you know, in their next response. And then just in, you know, good question writing, try to stay away from all of the above or none of the above. Or the ones I hate the most are like you give them like A through F, and then you say like A and B but not C and things like that. So they turn into these logic puzzles instead of staying focused on the content for the students. I think those are stressful.
And if you do have some multiple select questions mixed in with multiple choice, make sure you include something that makes it explicit so that students recognize the possibility that there may be more than one correct option. It's not as bad as the A and C or B and D type combinations, but it is a bit challenging. It's important that students recognize that there may well be, and there often will be, more than one correct option, but at least it's a binary choice, or evaluating each statement by itself, which is a bit more straightforward.
And with that said, you know, we can never eliminate all these things completely, because I know like our nursing students take those NCLEX and they have questions like that, and you know they've got to pass that test. So giving them practice with those confusing questions can be helpful if that's something that's out of your control because your accrediting agent is doing this. But I try to steer clear of things like that. And that's the end of that. So if you have more suggestions or more things that you're already doing that foster inclusion in an asynchronous course, we would love for you to add them. You know, fill out the little form here so we can add them to the site. That would be fantastic.
And any questions or comments in general?
Or let's see.
Or thoughts or reactions or suggestions on, you know, besides filling out the form, are there any things that you can think of offhand or suggestions you'd like to make?
Linda's brain is full, and I totally relate to that. I totally. And anytime we do a presentation like this, like I just want to take a nap now.
I'm teaching
I'll
my
just add-
first. Oh, I'm sorry.
Go ahead. Go ahead.
I'm teaching my first online course, fully online course ever. And yeah, so I'm kind of like, whoa, I got to get this.
Well, and you know, so course improvement, you know, it's a perpetual thing, right? Like none of us have the perfect online course right out of the gate. We just go from semester to semester trying to strengthen the courses and add in or you know, edit things as we learn more about them and as we see how the students are responding to what you put in there. So don't be too hard on yourself. You can only do so much. But
Tobin suggests a +1 strategy. Each time you teach a course, add one new thing, but not Not try to do everything all at once. It's just not going to work very well. And the first time you attempt something, it often will not work very well, but learn from it and see what worked, what aspects of it didn't, and then perhaps provide students with a bit more structure the next time so that it will work more smoothly. And by the second or third time you do it, it's likely to work much better.
Right, and I always advise people to think before the class even starts, think about how you're going to track things that you want to change. So for example, I always say if two or more students ask you the same question, that needs to be addressed in your content going forward. So think of how you're going to track things like that. So that say you don't do this course again till next spring, you know, a year has gone by now and you might not remember all those things that at the time seemed so important. So find a way to track things so that when you do go to strengthen the course for the next time you're teaching it, you've got all your ideas written right in front of you.
And you could do that on a hidden folder or a hidden document in the course itself so that you don't lose track of where you stored it. And that's a really common strategy that I should use more myself, but it's one that I have used from time to time and should be using now.
I love to see all this input into the Jamboard. That's awesome. And as we said, like this will stay open so people can circle back to this later on if you have more ideas or if you want to come back and check and see if somebody else posted something. And the link to this was up at the top of the website. So if you can bookmark the website, you'll be able to get back to everything, all the resources.
Some really good suggestions in there too.
Yeah.
Yeah, we went through the last part a little more quickly, so. Okay.
Good. Well, we have what, 2 minutes left. Any final thoughts in the last 2 minutes?
I was just going to add, I think sometimes you have to balance some things that I know would be more inclusive to things that I have to do for other reasons. You know, sometimes there's issues of scale, right?
Right.
Maybe not in the online course, but some things don't scale as well as others. But I think the other one too is, you know, like you mentioned, timing of exams and things like that. And, you know, I've had to try and do maybe generous, but some timing, you know, try to compromise on that in terms of academic integrity. So I mean, even if I know it's maybe not as inclusive as I want to be, so you might give a 2-day window with a timer that starts, you know, so they can choose the best time that they have to take an exam or something like that, but I'm going to have to time. Otherwise, it got to be problematic, but yeah,
Right.
so I would just, yeah, I think sometimes we're actually, you know, you want to make an inclusive course, but there are other things you have to do in the course as well. I mean, you mentioned too with nursing, and sometimes you have an external constraint that you're worried about, so. I think it dovetails with what you and John said, that you can't do, you look at this and it's overwhelming, you think I have to do all this. Well, start with a few and
Yes.
build from there.
Start with the low hanging fruit, right? So make that welcome video and tell them when they're going to hear. Do those 2 things. And then you're on your way. And thank you all for joining us. This is really fun.
Thank you.
Thank you.
All right. And John, thank you for having me. I really do appreciate it.
Well, and thank you for joining us. Now I got to find the video.
Well, you guys stop recording.
Yeah, but where did that go? Maybe it's behind here. No. Okay, I see where it is.
I'm going to hop off, but thank you, and we'll see you again.
Okay, thank you.
Yep, thank you. Bye-bye.